Hey all, Momo Monday will return next week. I'm just having a little bit of trouble getting back on the horse involving the little bit of extra editing that Momo Monday takes, putting all the short adorableness clips together at once because of the live Thursday shows that I'm now doing with Ed the Sock. Fridays are a bit of a crunch right into the weekend. But anyway, it is Martin Luther King Jr. Day in the United States. I hope our American friends are having a peaceful holiday. And I thought this was a good opportunity to look at, a physical representation of racism, just to try to get away from this idea that it's about using the wrong word or, these less important things in terms of grand scale economic issues stuff that we tend to confuse. And so I want to look at the historical, I shouldn't say historical, a form of it is going on to this day, but the practice of redlining that started in the 1930s with the New Deal and continues on in some form or another, at least until the subprime mortgage crisis of the 2000 decade. And what redlining was a lot of people think it's the physical pushing down of properties in black neighborhoods. That wasn't quite what it was. The New Deal, of course, came out of the Great Depression when a lot of people had lost their homes and were barely hanging on to their homes. And so the National Housing Act of, I believe it was 1934, was designed to make home ownership more affordable. Now, to do that, a national government agency went through and color-coded the various neighborhoods and cities across America with, you'll see at the bottom there, green is best, B is still desirable, C is in decline, and D is hazardous. And one of the measurement tools that it used was the homogeneousness of the neighborhood, meaning how white it was. And so if there were more black people in a neighborhood, it was downgraded. And what that meant is that black people couldn't get mortgages at the preferential rates that white people could because they were more likely to live in a black neighborhood. But not only that, their very existence in a neighborhood, pushed it out of green to blue or pushed it out of blue into yellow territory. And the reason I have this map of Chicago up is, you might notice if you recognize the landscape of Chicago, that the red areas practically rough out South Side down here. And, this replicates in cities across America. So when you hear a certain president-elect going on about cities falling apart and crumbling, they didn't just get that way. The problem was that the reinvestment that happened in the blue and green areas didn't get into the yellow, certainly not the red areas, and not even the yellow areas. And there were, certain urban renewal projects throughout the 70s and 80s that corrected some of the stuff in the yellow areas. But the problems go so deep as to, there are no grocery stores in the red neighborhoods. There are no banks branches in the red neighborhoods. And the problem with a bank branch not being in the neighborhood is it doesn't get to know the neighborhood, so it's harder to get a loan. It's harder to get banking services in neighborhoods that don't have a bank branch. But the grocery stores, interesting phenomenon, red areas, red line districts, were more likely to have a proliferation of liquor stores. which led to more crime in those areas for kind of obvious reasons. People get really drunk and then do stupid things. But when there are a lot of liquor stores in a neighborhood, what you don't see is pharmacies, grocery stores, other sorts of stores, restaurants, that sort of stuff. And it became this systemic problem. If you think Chicago is an anomaly, I'll show you another city. This is Los Angeles. And these white neighborhoods in both Chicago and Los Angeles, these are the downtown business districts, so it gives you an idea. Now, up until a major urban revitalization effort that put in the convention center and the Staples Center, well, it is now the Staples Center, and that massive sprawling LA Live complex that's down in downtown LA, that part of Los Angeles used to be shithole, don't go there central. And of course, you know, the redlining extends all the way into Compton down here, and then it starts to creep into Inglewood here. Now, of course, the airport got put in Inglewood, and, you know, fancy people don't want to live near airports, but you'll see there's, like, you know, Beverly Hills out here. It's about what you expect. And these were artificial linkages between race and class that otherwise wouldn't have existed. So don't think about it as them suddenly coming in and taking away resources. What happened in these neighborhoods is the resources didn't flow in. And we saw, you know, by the time the civil rights movement in the 1960s, second wave feminism, kicked off, a huge divide among women between white feminists and black feminists is black feminists had completely different problems than the white women who were controlling the feminist movement. So it didn't speak to them. Black women were forced to choose between the civil rights fight and the fight for women's equality, and a great many black women chose to fight with racial struggles for, you know, fairly obvious reasons. They saw a place, they saw their issues being addressed in the civil rights movement and not in second wave feminism. So these issues are serious. They affect everything from marriage statistics to crazy stuff like insurance. And of course, what redlining eventually led to was, and Chicago, places like Chicago, places like Atlanta, where there were a lot of state-backed mortgages. The subprime mortgages were deliberately offered more to black people than white people. In some cases, they were actually offered through the black churches. That the bank would make a donation to these black megachurches whenever someone took out a loan from that church. And they were, of course, these high-risk, subprime mortgages that were traded on these securities exchanges that eventually went bluey, and a bunch of people ended up with, you know, underwater mortgages, crazy spiraling interest rates, all this stuff. And so when you hear all these things about certain parts of cities crumbling and schools being no good and all that stuff, unless you start hearing that the person saying this has an understanding of why, how these were systemic federal policies that got us to this point, not by taking anything away, by not adding as much to those neighborhoods as other whiter, better colored on the map neighborhoods got. And this, I grew up in a black neighborhood. It was actually quite multicultural, but there were a lot more black people in the Jane Finch area of Toronto, where I grew up. And an interesting thing happened when I was just finishing high school in Toronto. This doesn't just affect America. I want to put some perspective here. What happened during the 1960s and 1970s is that these neighborhoods, the neighborhood I grew up in, was there was heavy investment. It was the opposite. There were a lot of youth centers. There were a lot of after school programs. And those started to decline as, the bills came in from the massive development programs in the 1960s and 1970s that nobody bothered to figure out how to pay for. And so there was a bit of a clawing back in the 1980s that accelerated in the 1990s. And a premier named Mike Harris made massive cuts to all these social programs that prevented trouble instead of, went out and arrested people and the stuff you can see. The thing about preventative social programs is you don't see something being prevented. The crime statistics just don't, or they start falling. And the worst thing you can do in a government program is be effective. Because if you start seeing real change, they go, well, your mandate is done, and they cut the program. Well, what happens then? The effect of the program disappears, and all of a sudden we got an increase in crime in these neighborhoods. Now, the other thing that happened was that because there had been investment in these Black neighborhoods where I grew up, all of a sudden there were community centers, there were malls, there was transit, there's amenities in these areas. So what started happening I'd say it was a little later than that. It was the condo boom that really took it off there. And so all this redevelopment started happening. New townhouses, the buildings got cleaned up, the mall got refaced. And what ended up happening is something called the water balloon effect. And what the reason they call that is, if you have a water balloon, you push down in the middle of it, everything spreads out to the side. Well, that was what happened to the impoverished populations in the neighborhood I grew up. They started being pushed further and further out to the outskirts of the city. And what that meant was that all those wonderful community centers and all these programs, the increased policing, everything that was designed to kind of keep a lid on these problems, well, people got pushed out into neighborhoods where that infrastructure didn't exist. And so we have a growing gun problem and murder problem and gang violence problem in Toronto. Now, it is not anywhere near as serious as the US, but we are seeing firsthand how when you don't maintain these social programs, when you don't keep putting the infusions in, things do start falling apart. Anybody who's a homeowner knows that home ownership is it's an ongoing list of repairs. There's something always broken when you own your own house. And when you rent, there's something broken because the landlord won't fix it. But if you want to do something kind of conscious today, I'm going to be a bit cheeky and say, if you want to do something woke today, look up redlining in America. And if you're not in America, see if there aren't similar things. And it might not be along class lines. It could be along religious lines in certain places in Europe. I mean, the Jewish ghettos in certain parts of Europe are part of that history. It could be along class lines. It might not be Black people that were affected. There are certainly in Los Angeles, the number of Asian people factored in to this area here is Little Tokyo. So the area right by that white part in the middle, because that's the business center. That's where Little Tokyo is right now. So it's not just about black and white. It's about an unnatural link between race and class that was done because people thought it was natural. And it in fact was not natural. It was people's pre-existing biases, bias, that's what is multiple biases. But it was that creeping in and creating self-fulfilling prophecies. And so this is why the words normal and natural are that can be very dangerous words in terms of social policy, because a lot of the science they're finding now that backed up the fact that, yes, these things are normal, these things are scientifically proven to be natural inclinations of certain races, they were actually flawed science because of racist attitudes among the teams doing the studies. And I mean, I'm sure you can imagine how insidious that gets. What can you trust? Well, my general rule of thumb is don't trust any don't trust any study over 10 years old unless it's been replicated by newer stuff, or more or less than 2 years old. You have to be really careful about those newer studies too, because they haven't been properly peer reviewed. And you'll see a lot of these smaller studies too. And I know you guys are really big on sample size. So, and I have this friend of mine who got his PhD. He's a master statistician. He is really good at breaking down this data. And you have to do the small study to get money to do the big study. And that doesn't mean that the small study is bad. It's just the small study is small. And all the small study does is goes, look, there's reason to research this more. And then a school goes, okay, here's some money, hopefully. And they get to do a larger one, or another school gets to do a larger one. But you have to sort of prove that there's a reason to throw a whole bunch of money in 3 years at something like that. And this has affected video games as well. This bias in science, but also this study gap, because a lot of our attitudes, a lot of our assumptions about what video games do and don't do came from that period between when the original flawed studies came out, which were small, and the much larger, much more reliable studies that, of course, showed there was no link between video games and violent video games and violent behavior. People who were more likely to do bad things liked games with that content, but it did not cultivate the attitudes or behaviors. There was no conditioning. There was no cultivated effect in attitudes, and nothing. Zip. Nothing. But there was that gulf when a lot of opinions were formed. And it's very hard to get those opinions out of people's heads, because the big press boom was when the issue was new. And those preliminary studies that were, of course, financed by people who wanted to find something wrong with video games, those were the ones that made the news. The studies that showed absolutely no link whatsoever, with thousands of people involved, those didn't get as much, it didn't get into the bloodstream, so to speak. And the same thing is happening with sexism and gaming, that a few early studies came out with an agenda that showed, oh, this is what happened, 15 minutes after playing games, people behaved more sexist if the game was sexist. 15 minutes after a game, I think I'm a Kunari or a Krogan. I'm kidding, but you know what I mean. I'll walk around talking like an Elcor and things like that. It's not because these are my deeply held beliefs. It's because it's fun. Because you're being a goof. But there's no long-term impact. And that long-term, longitudinal studies, I think that, no, that's the wrong word, but, studies done over years to actually measure permanent impact take time. And in that ensuing time, some really false attitudes have been allowed to spread because, ironically, they were cultivated by the mainstream media. So, my challenge to you is just question what you believe is normal today. Question what you believe is natural. And not only is it a really interesting experiment that may actually make you learn a thing or two, but it'll make you less likely to be part of those knee-jerkers that jump on things based on common sense that is neither.